Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. It's often said that Australia was built on the sheep's back, but could equally be said that Australia's prosperity came out of the ground. We are truly the lucky country when it comes to our natural resources. One company that figures large in the development of Australia's mining industry is, of course, Rio Tinto. Joining me to discuss the history of Rio is author Dr. Robert Porter. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Robert.
Thank you, Georgina. Pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you here, and this is a fabulous book you've written, Rio Tinto in Australia, the origins and formations of an international resources company. What a piece of work about such an iconic company, and I can't say Australian, of course, but such an iconic company. Can you tell me about the origins of Rio Tinto? Because the name kind of sounds, a bit Spanish.
Yes, indeed. That's a good observation. I mean, the company commenced in 1873, and it was based upon quite ancient copper mines in Spain, the Huelva province of Spain, and that was the underpinning for the company. And my story really starts much later than that. In 1954, the interest in the Spanish mines were sold by Rio Tinto in London. And with the proceeds, the company decided that it would continue with its program of international diversification, which included, at that time, an involvement in the Rhodesian Copper Belt, significant interest in uranium in Canada, and in some respects, the next cab off the rank was Australia. And so the effort started in Australia in about 1953.
It's interesting. It's a British company, but it has no mining interests in Britain. They're all international.
Yes. Again, I haven't researched the details of the international company. I mean, it had some exploration activity and in the UK, but predominantly was an international resources company looking to expand further.
Yeah. And of course, with Australia part of the British Commonwealth, the empire having ended by the 50s, really, or really in its dying days, this was an easy place, no doubt, for this British company to do business.
Yes, that's correct. And it was not unusual. There was another large British company that looked to expand its international operations, and the view was an appropriate place to look at the dominions or to look at investing in Australia. In the case of Rio Tinto, its initial interest in Australia was in involvement in uranium exploration. It had that experience in Canada. It had associations with the United Kingdom Atomic Energy Authority, the US Atomic Energy Authority. And so they thought they could utilise those relationships and knowledge of the uranium market and look at the prospectivity for uranium in Australia, which was evident at that stage. Rum Jungle was about to commence under the aegis of the Commonwealth Government with another company managing that. So uranium...
And that was a mine in the Northern Territory, wasn't it?
That's correct.
Yes, I love the name Rum Jungle.
Yes, it sounds exotic, doesn't it?
It does. You just sort of wonder what people got up to up there. And of course, uranium was quite a new mineral, wasn't it, to mine, given the advent of the civil and military nuclear industry?
Yes, well, certainly, I mean, given the development of atomic weapons during the period of the Second World War, there was a military usage for uranium oxide, but also the view at that time, this is in the 1950s, was that uranium could be a source of civil energy demand, and certainly there were plans in various countries, including the UK, for uranium to be a source of civilian energy. So from that point of view, the perspective was that the demand looked quite favourable for uranium. Also, as I said, Rio Tinto in London had established relationships with atomic energy authorities. Australia had established the Australian Atomic Energy Commission in 1952, and there was a Bureau of Geology and Geophysical Resources which was undertaking exploration work. So Rio Tinto was able in some respects to call upon those resources in Australia.
Did you get a sense that Rio Tinto was very in sync with the British government? I mean, it obviously had this relationship or an arrangement with the UK Atomic Energy Authority, but I mean, definitely in the early history of Rio Tinto, and actually sort of seems throughout its history, it's had a problem in Australia of being seen as a British company and too close to the British government.
Well, it was one of the bastions of British economy in some respects, post-war British economy. It did have very close relationships with government and with the business elite within the UK. And yes, certainly the relationships were quite strong. The chairman of Rio Tinto in London, the chap named Val Duncan, met with the UK Treasury before he came out to Australia. So yes, they were able to utilise those connections. I mean, in terms of Australia's perspective on Rio Tinto, it was obviously a new company in the country. I mean, Bob Menzies was aware of it. In fact, in my book, I said, if I can just quote what he said to Val Duncan when he came to Australia in 1954, he said that Rio Tinto was, in his view, one of the most fascinating mining names he had conjured with since he was a small boy, and he would be delighted if the company established a presence in Australia. So that probably
good introduction.
Well, it probably reflected Bob Menzies' depth of knowledge and reading, because I don't think necessarily Rio Tinto was that well known in Australia in the 1950s.
Well, and I wonder too, he had an affection for Britain. He felt reassured that it was a British company, an important British company, and he was pleased that there was British interest in investing in Australia.
Oh, I think so, Georgina. I mean, it was an established company. It was financially solid. It was reputable. And I think there clearly was a desire, as you're aware, for post-war forms of economic development to be nurtured. And mining, which had been in a quiescent state for a period of time, was one of those areas where there were significant opportunities. And yes, so I think, as Menzies had supported other British companies, there was one called Consolidated Zinc, which was responsible for the establishment of an integrated aluminium industry in Australia. He had very good relations with the senior executives and the directors of that company and was prepared to facilitate their involvement. I think he knew less about Rio Tinto, but nonetheless saw it as a reputable company to be involved in Australia.
But regardless of Robert Menzies' positive thoughts on Rio Tinto, Rio's entry into the Australian market was pretty controversial, wasn't it? I mean, there was a lot of toing and froing about their interest in setting up a uranium mine here in Australia and of course, exporting that uranium back to Britain.
Yes, I think that's partially the case. I mean, the entry of Rio Tinto to be involved in uranium, I don't think in itself was necessarily controversial.
No.
As I said, that was an area of potential mineral development that the government was prepared to support. I think the area which did create a little controversy was just ensuring that Australia's interests were protected. The contracts for the uranium, which was eventually came into Rio Tinto's possession, was to be sold to the United Kingdom Atomic Energy Commission. Rio Tinto was to obtain loan funds from the UK government. So there was a concern that Rio Tinto, in effect, could be seen as an arm of the British government. It was looking for large volumes of uranium. And there was a concern by senior public servants and also a concern reflected by Menzies himself to ensure that Australia's national interests were protected and that Australia didn't hand over an unlimited amount of uranium resources to the British, because at that stage we weren't really clear what the extent of the uranium resources were. And there was also a desire to ensure that some of the smaller Australian companies that wanted to get involved in Australia were not pushed out of place by Rio Tinto's presence.
Yes, and this is a theme and a reaction of the Australian government that repeats itself time and time again through the development of our mining industry, doesn't it? That, make sure the Aussie companies do well and don't allow foreign interests to be put in a preferential position or, be taking our resources offshore without us making sure we can get what we require domestically.
Yes, indeed. And I think perhaps more so after Menzies was out of power, John Gorton was probably the first manifestation of a greater degree of nationalistic interest in terms of ownership and control of Australian resources. And that obviously reached its high point, if you like, with the Whitlam government and RFX Connor and the sort of resource nationalism of the Whitlam Labor government. And I think that continued to some extent in the 1980s. There was concern with foreign control of our natural resources. And it was one of the issues that Rio Tinto, Rio Tinto changed its name to Conzinc Rio Tinto of Australia in 1962 when it merged with a company called Consolidated Zinc. So if I swap between Rio Tinto and CRA, that's the reason, because the company's identity changed in 1962. But the issue from 1962 62 and more into the 70s was that CRA was a foreign-owned and controlled company, and it was restricted in its investment opportunities. So it had to sort that problem out in some respects. And that was a major area of focus.
And that's, of course, where the personalities come to the fore, don't they? I mean, Val Duncan you've mentioned already, but there was Maurice Morby, who was quite the figure, wasn't he? He was a legendary mining figure and legendary in the development of CRA's place in Australia.
Yes.
So those individuals, I mean, we think of contemporary mining magnates these days. Most people would know their names. They were recognisable names back then too, weren't they?
I think so. And it's one of the really interesting things from my point of view that there were some significant individuals, both in the government and the public service and in the private sector, that really were trying to achieve things. And Maurice Morby was Broken Hill born and bred, came up in quite straitened circumstances, but self-educated, self-trained. And he was working for a company called Consolidated Zinc, which was actually also listed in Britain. So it was not an Australian company per se, although its origins were Australian. And he always would define his objectives as contributing to Australia's national development. And his view was that in order of priority, the company Consolidated Zinc had to look after its relationships with government, its relationships with its employees, and then the shareholders, which is not necessarily the order that you would have companies articulate today. But Morby was a significant individual and played a major role in some major minerals developments, which we probably will touch upon in a moment.
So you saw him through your research as quite the patriot of Australia, despite the fact that he worked for non-Australian companies for his career.
Yes. Well, I mean, he was perplexed or bemused when he was chairman of CRA, and CRA would be criticised as being foreign-owned and controlled. Now, it was, so he wasn't being disingenuous, but his whole career in mineral development in Australia, exploration, metallurgical practices, bringing operations into production, was about making a contribution to Australia's national development. I mean, I put people like Morby in the same category as some of the great post-war public servants who were concerned with post-war reconstruction. He was concerned with post-war economic development. I mean, Morby and a number of his colleagues were in protected industries during the Second World War, and they made a major contribution on various government commissions in terms of looking at accessing minerals during the Second World War. So he was a technical secretary of a copper and bauxite commission. So I think there was true sense of national responsibility and national duty on people such as Morby. Yes, they had to make a profit in their business activities, but it wasn't the prime motivation. So I think Australia was fortunate that we had individuals of that stature, and they tended to have very good relationships with government. I mean, Morby had impeccable relationships with Menzies. He could ask for a meeting, go to Canberra or meet him in Melbourne, wherever it might be, and what was meant to be a 15-minute meeting would be 90 minutes. And I've seen some of the exchanges between them, and they could be very frank and very honest, and they respected each other for what they were trying to do.
I don't know if it's connected, but when Menzies retires as Prime Minister in January 1966, he, like all his successors and predecessors, I'm sure, sets up a post-prime ministerial office, and it's in the CRA building, 95 Collins Street, which obviously in the late 80s was demolished and now is 101 Collins Street, very famous, iconic building on Collins Street. But, so 95 Collins Street, the CRA building, was also an iconic 1960s building that Robert Menzies had his office in until he died in 1978. I mean, I don't know. We can make it up, Robert, whether that has any meaning or bearing on the depth of the relationship between Morby and CRA and Robert Menzies.
Look, I think it does. It's a very good point to make, Georgina. In fact, somebody who used to work at CRA and then Rio Tinto told me the story that when Menzies had the office in 95 Collins Street, he would drive in. I should remember the make of his car. I think it was a black Daimler, and he would have his driver, and I was told the driver's name, I've just forgotten it, but Bob Menzies would say to Maury Morby, Maury would drive in his Rover, apparently, and Menzies said to Maury, a man with your standing and stature should have your own driver. And Maury's response to that was, the only time I have a driver when it'll be a hearse taking me to be buried, type of thing. So I think they had a mutual respect. So I think, providing an office in 95 Collins Street, I had no knowledge of the circumstances, but it wasn't seen to be a sinecure or a payoff or anything like that. It was just a sign of respect.
Right, yeah. So back to the uranium mine that Rio Tinto's intent on opening in Australia to supply the UK Atomic Energy Authority. Can you tell me about the genesis of this mine called Mary Kathleen? I wonder where this Mary Kathleen comes from. So we've got Rum Jungle.
Yes.
I think there's South Alligator.
That's right.
Also in the Northern Territory. But Mary Kathleen is in Queensland.
That's right, between Cloncurry and Mount Isa.
Mount Isa, yes, yeah.
Well, Rio Tinto explored in the Northern Territory. I mean, it had a very expansive, very ambitious program in the Northern Territory. They pulled in technical personnel from various parts of the Rio Tinto empire and were prepared to spend, for the time, massive amounts of funds on trying to explore and find uranium themselves. They were unsuccessful. They were advised by Lindsay Clark, who was with Western Mining Corporation, that there was a bit of a uranium rush in Queensland because at that stage the Commonwealth government were offering £25,000 rewards for a discovery of uranium. And there was a range of basically amateur prospectors who were looking for uranium and copper in Queensland. And there was a syndicate called the Walton and McConchie Syndicate. Now, there's Clem Walton, I think, was a taxi driver, and McConchie, I think, was a station hand and part-time prospector. And the latter had been prospecting for a number of years, very unsuccessful. He thought about throwing it in, but his wife, whose name was Mary Kathleen, said, no, keep on going, keep at it. You enjoy it. You might strike it lucky one of these days. And they discovered this uranium deposit and pegged it, and they called the lease Mary Kathleen. Now, Mary Kathleen had died 2 weeks later. And so the name remained with the mining operation itself. Apparently the first child born at the township of Mary Kathleen was called Mary Kathleen. So her legacy lived on for a period of time.
Yeah. And Robert Menzies led the official opening of this mine, didn't he, in 1958?
Yes, he did.
Can you imagine a Prime Minister today opening a uranium mine? Maybe it's coming back, actually.
Yes. Well, it was a significant new minerals development in Australia, that's for sure. And his department and the Department of National Development had been involved in it. And I think by this stage, the relationships had developed with Rio Tinto as it was then. And yes, he opened the mine, and it was a grand affair with himself and Dame Patty attending. They went down Viscount aircraft and they toured the mine site. The opening ceremony occurred, and Bob Menzies was very, very impressed with the township of Mary Kathleen. So this was one of the first planned mining townships. An architect or two architects had been brought in to design it. So Bob Menzies was very, very impressed, not least with the fact that it had a fully grassed cricket pitch, which he thought was quite amazing.
You would have won him over at that. Absolutely.
That's right.
Yes, he said, it is the most remarkable model town I have ever seen in my life, not least for its fully grassed cricket ground.
That's correct.
And I understand Dame Patty awarded a trophy for the winner of the home garden contest, followed by an open-air dinner of chicken and lobster on the Sports Oval. So
that's right.
Shipping in that lobster from...
It was quite a grand affair.
Yeah.
And look, it was a remarkable development. A lake, dam, reservoir facilities were built, which enabled market gardens to be maintained. So I think Dame Patty, awarded a prize for some of the agricultural produce which was grown in the area, which is quite remarkable.
But after the opening of Mary Kathleen, it was pretty slow going for Rio Tinto in Australia, wasn't it? I mean, we think of it now, of course, as the great iron ore mining company. And, you obviously chart that history, but it didn't happen in a speedy trajectory, did it?
No. I mean, in some respects, it was a very fortuitous commencement. They had this mining operation. It had a tax-free status. It had secured contracts. So it was actually a very profitable mine and very efficient mine.
And the tax-free status had been negotiated, obviously, with the Menzies government to facilitate the development.
That's correct. And that was for a limited period of time. I think it was negotiated, so it could be for a longer period of time. So I think for the entire operation of the mine, first phase, it was a tax-free status. So there were significant dividends derived from Mary Kathleen Uranium, which was the name of the company owned by Rio Tinto Mining, and they were reinvested in a range of business evaluation activities. I mean, everything was looked at, from asbestos, manganese, iron ore, salt. I mean, it was just an incredibly wider range of minerals that were looked at. And there was a chap by the name of Ben Dickinson who had been employed, who was the former director of the State Department of Mines, who was incredibly active. The issue that he faced and created great frustration for him was that he thought his fellow directors, with the exception of maybe one or two, had no mining knowledge at all. So he would put forward all of these proposals and they would either get knocked back or they just would not progress at all. So in the end, he grew increasingly frustrated. The other party to enter the scene was Lang Hancock and Peter Wright. They introduced Rio Tinto again to a range of opportunities, not least asbestos and manganese, and later iron ore. And Lang Hancock became very frustrated with Rio Tinto's, what he considered the slovenly approach to sort of pursuing the business opportunity that they had presented to him. And he is quoted as saying that the local mob in Melbourne couldn't so much as lick a stamp without the say-so of some chap in London who was Val Duncan. So Lang Hancock said, we gave up the local mob and we started lobbying Val Duncan in London. So there was...
And Val Duncan was more persuadable?
Well, Val Duncan, I think, was concerned that here you had a new arm of Rio Tinto in Australia, which had had, as I said, quite a favourable commencement. And the issue now facing Rio Tinto, I'm talking about 1961, the company accepted initial public shareholding, so it had a listing on Australian stock exchanges, and the contract for Mary Kathleen Uranium was going to complete in 1963 or 1964, and there was really no chance of that being extended. So you had a company that had a tax-free status, was predominantly foreign-owned, and had accepted public shareholding, but its revenue source was quite limited. And there were no new material opportunities that had been executed by the local management team in Australia. So I think he was prepared to at least listen to Lang Hancock. In fact, he came out to Australia in 1961 and engaged with the Western Australian government because Lang Hancock had introduced Rio Tinto to these iron ore deposits near his property in the Hamersley Ranges. So Duncan had 4 days of meetings with the Western Australian government, including Charles Court, who was the Minister for Industrial Development. He didn't have much success because the view of the state government of Western Australia was that Rio Tinto did not have any steel-making experience or expertise. And what the Western Australian government wanted, if they were to provide iron ore tenements to particularly foreign-owned companies, was that they would be able to commit to developing a steel industry in Western Australia. So that door, in effect, was closed to Rio Tinto in 1961. So it was somewhat of a crisis for the company at that stage for the reasons that I indicated. And really its fortunes changed when, in 1962, there was a merger between the British-based Consolidated Zinc and also Rio Tinto in London, and in Australia, CRA was formed.
And was it much easier then for CRA to deal with the Western Australian government? Or, I mean, they still couldn't overcome the fact that they didn't have the steel experience?
This is where the brilliance of Sir Maurice Morby comes to the fore. As I said, he was the chairman of Consolidated Zinc before the merger with Rio Tinto. He became the chairman of CRA. He had impeccable relationships with senior politicians, as I said, including Menzies. Charles Court he knew very, very well. And in effect, what he did before the merger was consummated between Rio Tinto and Consolidated Zinc is that he invited, or had Rio Tinto invite, a chap by the name of Tom Price, who worked for Kaiser Steel, to come to Australia and look at these iron ore deposits.
And Kaiser Steel was an American company.
Sorry, yes, it was American. It had its own iron ore operations.
And this name, Tom Price, of course, is famous to this day. It's the name of a mine.
No, that's right. So the 76-year-old Tom Price came to Australia, was fabulously impressed with these iron ore deposits that Lang Hancock had introduced. They were low grade, they're called limonite deposits, lower grade, still high quality in terms of the chemical characteristics. And the fact that Tom Price came to Western Australia, met with the Western Australian Cabinet and introduced, as I said, by Murray Morby, this gave the Western Australian government confidence that what was soon to be CRA had the ability to be able to exploit these iron ore deposits.
With Kaiser Steel.
With Kaiser Steel being involved.
Yeah.
As a potential steel-making partner, that's right.
Yeah. So overlaid on this though, Rob, is the fact that up until 1961, I think I'm right, or 1960, it was illegal to export iron ore from Australia. And it's hard for people, I think, these days to imagine that Australia banned for quite some time the export of iron ore.
Yes.
When we think so much of our prosperity is down to the export of iron ore. But yes, we didn't know how much we had. We didn't think we had very much, did we?
Well, no, that's right. In fact, because you couldn't export iron ore.
There was no point exploring for it, I guess.
Exactly the case. And the major iron ore producer in Australia was BHP. They were the prime steelmaking company. They effectively had a monopoly. Now, the view from Murray Morby was that BHP very carefully managed this monopoly and also impeded the possibility of iron ore being opened up earlier for export. Whether that's the case, I'm not completely sure. But this was one of the issues. So in 1960-61, when Rio Tinto had been introduced to these iron ore deposits by Lang Hancock, London was quite sceptical. One, these deposits were 350 kilometres from the coast in areas which were not inhabited. There was no infrastructure. The capital costs would be massive. You would have to sell large volumes. At that stage, markets had not been established as they were later in Japan. So it was an it was almost a sort of a tilt of the windmill type of project. And I think, again, it's to credit of Sir Maurice Morby that he saw the potential with the iron ore in Western Australia and was able to assemble the necessary attributes, both in terms of Kaiser's involvement. Kaiser also gave access or helped facilitate access to international finance. And Consolidated Zinc also brought a cadre of very experienced engineers and managers who had the ability to give effect to this massive project, which then became, as you said, Mount Tom Price was the name of the deposit subsequently discovered, not introduced by Hancock, but subsequently discovered by Consolidated Zinc. And the Hamersley iron ore development based on Mount Tom Price became the first of a number of export-orientated iron ore developments, which really transformed the Australian economy and still significantly affect the Australian economy to this day.
Yeah. And, of course, Sir Maurice Morby was able to get that export licence.
By 1968, there'd been, as you said, a relaxation of the iron ore embargo in 1960, and by 1968 it was lifted altogether.
Why do you think we know of people like Lang Hancock and Peter Wright, but Sir Maurice Morby, I don't think his name isn't as recognisable as the others. Why is that?
It's a good question. I mean, Lang Hancock was a very colourful character. He was an entrepreneur, no doubt about that. Wasn't necessarily well regarded within the Western Australian government. In fact, Rio Tinto's reputation suffered because they were seen to be too closely associated with Lang Hancock. And Charles Court actually asked Murray Morby if he would get Lang Hancock out of his hair, so he just didn't have to deal with this. Yeah, I don't know. I think there are a number of people who have made a significant contribution in this case in the mining sector who are perhaps not as well appreciated as they should be.
Do you think it's because he worked for a British company fundamentally and was not, even though he was a patriot and deeply believed in the post-war reconstruction of Australia, because he was employed by a British company, he wasn't really seen as one of us?
Well,
was there an element of that?
It could be. I mean, his early career, as I said before, was in Broken Hill.
I mean, he was Australian.
He was Australian, that's right. And
born and bred through his career.
Broken Hill was, in some respects, the cradle of at least lead and zinc mining and processing Australia. I don't know. I mean, I think he was a man who was fairly modest, but committed to making a contribution in the area of exploration and mine development. Yeah. I don't know, perhaps that's maybe the fate of modest people. They're not as well remembered or recognised.
Never be modest. That's the lesson. How important was Japan to the development of Hammersley and the Rio's iron ore facilities and mines and, of course, exports? Because, this is a time when we had signed the commerce agreement with Japan in 1957. Japan is industrialising quickly, and this is an opportunity for Australia to feed the industrialisation of Japan and help grow its economy.
No, exactly the case. It was the phenomenon of the post-war industrialisation of Japan, centrally directed to a large extent, with consortium of steel companies, central buying arrangements, and the nature of the development of Hammersley iron ore, or iron ore in the Hammersley area, was quite different to other forms of mining which had occurred in Australia. It was bulk mining. It needed large equipment. You needed to extract and ship and sell large volumes to be able to sort of make sure that you could recoup the large capital expenditure and operating costs involved in it. And so Japan, with its steel-making industry, was seen to be the major opportunity. It wasn't the only market, but it was certainly the predominant market for iron ore coming out of the Pilbara area. So this required structuring contracts and sales agreements with the Japanese steel mills. And you just reflect upon it a little bit. Some of the men who were involved in this from the Australian side had either served in the war or just come through the war experience. So there was still that, if not overt, maybe underlying antipathy towards Japan and things Japanese. But they got over that and were able to structure long-term contracts for both iron ore and also for intermediate products, pellets, which were produced in Australia, and was a very, very significant part of Australia's post-war economic development, along with other things as well. But I think iron ore was the major underpinning.
When CRA was listed on the Australian Stock Exchange, did that change perceptions around its identity as an Australian entity and we could sort of trust it as an Australian company, or were there still lingering concerns that it was British?
No, it's a good question. I think it did to some extent, and I think from the point of view that you had a management structure within CRA, which largely came out of Consolidated Zinc. So even though that had been a British company, most of those individuals had worked in Australia, were well known to people in government. So I think there was a view that, okay, this is now potentially quite a significant company in Australia.
Rio wasn't sending people from London too much. Although, in your book, you've got lovely photos of Val Duncan, of course, travelling around the iron ore mines. And
No, I think Val Duncan was quite astute. He realised that there was a degree of resource nationalism which grew and became stronger, and that it was an appropriate thing to ensure that local management, Australian management, took on more and more responsibility. There was always this tension, though, because you had London wanting to control, wanting to be involved in things. And this happened with the contractual arrangements in Japan. Maury Morby was quite happy to have some of his men, not all men, looking after the contractual arrangements. London wanted to make sure they had their own representatives there. Val Duncan even wanted to be involved in some of the iron ore negotiations. So there were tensions and difficulties which Maury Morby had to sort of navigate. So I think it did adopt a more of an Australian character. And I think it also generated a motivation by the Australian management that we should have a greater degree of Australian ownership in CRA.
Yeah.
Maurice Morby pushed that, and then when Rod Carnegie became chief executive in 1972, that certainly was a major impetus for him to ensure that CRA adopted a greater degree, if not majority, Australian ownership, which did eventually occur.
Of course, the other big mining company we think of that era and still to this day is BHP, which come from Broken Hill, Maury Morby's hometown. How was that tension managed? Because, it's interesting you write about how CRA achieved what BHP had never been able to do. It thought it was inconceivable to develop major iron ore deposits in a remote location, hundreds of kilometres from the coastline, absolutely no infrastructure, completely uninhabited, well, at least by European settlers, and then develop it, link it to the Japanese market. And I think in the 60s, CRA's expenditure was at a greater rate than that for the Snowy Mountains scheme, which was seen as the great Australian nation building exercise. And after 12 years, it had contributed $2.7 billion to Australia's balance of payment surplus. of 3.3 billion. It's amazing.
No, its contribution was very, very significant
But,
indeed.
BHP was the Australian company and...
Yes, because I've relied a lot on CRA records, my opinions may be a little bit filtered, but certainly the view from CRA was, if I just take the example of the Hamersley iron ore developments, Maurice Morby's view was that it should be seen as Australian national development, not a development necessarily by CRA.
Yeah.
CRA are a major participant. So Morby actually invited BHP to come and have a look at the deposits, which they did. At one stage, there was consideration maybe BHP should be an equity participant in the development of the Hamersley iron ore deposits. I mean, for CRA, that obviously had the advantage that BHP had steelmaking capabilities. I think CRA was essentially rebuffed by BHP on that score, and the view was that BHP was fairly arrogant. There was a citation that senior executive in BHP said, we have more than enough iron ore, it's, dripping from our ears type of thing. And BHP would say to the Japanese, you don't need to worry about any other party except for us. We've got enough iron ore to supply your needs. So there was a degree of tension, as you would expect, between CRA and BHP. And BHP, in some respects, also was focusing much more on its steel-making activities. CRA, by this stage, was broadly exploring. It was developed aluminium industry, obviously had the iron ore operations, still had its lead and zinc interests, and was undertaking regional exploration, which would lead to the discovery of the Bougainville deposit. So probably a more diversified minerals company than BHP was in those days. This is the 60s and 70s.
Well, of course, as you say, the development at Weipa, the bauxite mine, I mean, it's still there to this day. It's an incredibly significant development, and it works very closely with the local Indigenous community as well. And that was a commodity that was in demand in Japan and also contributed hugely to the development of that trading relationship.
It did, and also, in some respects, aluminium during the Second World War was seen as a strategic metal. And so there was a significant amount of government investment and activity in ensuring Australia could develop its own aluminium industry, involvement in the Commonwealth Government, Tasmanian Government involvement in the Bell Bay aluminium and alumina facilities in Tasmania. So Consolidated Zinc, again through efforts of Maurice Morby, were responsible for the Weipa discovery, which was at the time, may still be, I'm not sure, one of the largest bauxite discoveries. And that provided an underpinning for efforts which had been undertaken since probably 1944 to develop an integrated aluminium industry.
I liked reading your account of how they discovered the bauxite in Weipa. Was it some geologists were walking past and thought, those cliffs there look just like cliffs where there, can't remember the country, where there was other bauxite discovered. Yeah. Just by the look of the cliffs, they just look the same. So surely there's bauxite there.
Well, the story that I came across was that Maury Morby said to the explorationist who was going up to Cape York, they're actually looking for oil. That was the focus. And Maurice Morby handled a sample of bauxite and said, look, this is bauxite. Keep an eye out for it. You may find some. And lo and behold, they found this rock. And the man concerned realised it was similar to the specimen that he'd been shown by Maurice Morby, and it proved to be bauxite. So,
Wow, and what a find. Rob, how do you think CRA overcame that Australian aversion to foreign investment or foreign ownership? I mean, this particularly is in the 70s, of course, when there was a change in Australia's foreign investment policy. But, I mean, this is still something we struggle with as a country today, and governments really juggle the need for foreign investment and foreign ownership of businesses here, but also that sort of tendency that things should be Australian owned and Australian made.
Yeah. Well, I think the concern with foreign ownership in the mineral sector was very pronounced. It became towards the end of the 1960s, particularly obviously in the 70s, became quite pronounced. And the issue that CRA faced, particularly under the Whitlam government, was that they were restricted in terms of their abilities to invest in coal and other mineral opportunities. There were minimum Australian shareholding requirements, which meant that they would always be in a minority position. For them to gain investment approval, they had to go through quite laborious administrative processes, which took time. So there was a real impediment to CRA's ambitions to expand as a minerals company in Australia. That was one factor. I think also at this stage you had Rod Carnegie as the chief executive officer. I think, although a completely different individual to Maurice Morby, was also an Australian nationalist. He believed the Australian resources should be managed and owned ideally by Australians. He also thought employees in a resources or minerals company would be more motivated if they were working for Australia's outcomes as opposed to those of a foreign shareholder. So he had to solve this conundrum as to how the CRA could grow its business. And there were various things which were looked at. But in the end, there had to be an arrangement with the government whereby CRA would move to a higher level, if not ultimately majority Australian share ownership, and as a result of those intentions be able to then gain access on equal footing with the likes of BHP and CSR and Western Mining Corporation. I mean, CRA was also coming under implicit, if not explicit, criticism from BHP and CSR. I mean, they would not be reluctant to sort of say, well, look, they're foreigners. I mean, why give them a break? Why give them access to our resource opportunities? So something had to be done to solve that issue.
Yeah. When you look at the history of Rio's mines, CRA's mines in Australia, I mean, Mary Kathleen is a good example. They've obviously, when the mines close, the towns are abandoned. There's obviously remediation required, and it's particularly with uranium, it's not always easy. And in fact, there's an enduring legacy of issues around old tailings dams leaching out into the natural environment and really destroying the biodiversity of rivers and the surrounding areas. There's also, of course, the massive issue of recent times of demolition of the Juukan Gorge by Rio Tinto and all that goes with that. Mining is complicated. It has delivered Australia incredible prosperity. I mean, that is without question. But it does have a bit of an image problem. Is that something that is a more recent phenomenon, do you think, because of rising concern around environmental degradation and the issues around the treatment of Indigenous populations and their Indigenous artefacts? Or is that something that's always been a problem with mining?
I think it's probably more pronounced over recent years, recent decades. I mean, mining's always a challenge from the point of view that you're exploiting a non-renewable resource.
Yes.
In most cases, not all cases, you're leaving the landscape or landform different to what it was when you commenced mining. In the period that I looked at, some of the concerns with mining practices were exacerbated by the fact that these were foreign-owned companies rather than Australian companies that were exploiting the resource. And then, as you say, you had a range of new issues start to come into the landscape, so to speak. So Aboriginal land rights, the need for compensation, if not royalties being paid direct to, native title claimants. All of these sort of things became a much more complicating set of factors. So in some respects, I mean, the way that I've looked at the industry, it has evolved. I mean, some of the earlier practices would not be acceptable now. There's no doubt about that. The standards now required in terms of environmental assessments and remediation practices and even operation of mines, having worked in the mining sector for a while, I mean, really quite stringent. And obviously there's a high degree of focus on health, safety factors. So in some respects, it's been an evolution, a greater degree of sophistication of the industry. I mean, some of the things that I looked at in the earlier days of CRA, and WEEP is a good example, with the engagement of the local Aboriginal population, which was initially on a missionary reserves in effect. I mean, the initial response by the company was, well, that's for the government to handle. It's not really our responsibility. So there wasn't a requirement per se for the company to be involved. In many cases, the company realised if they did not get involved in how the relationships with local Aboriginal populations were conducted, then their reputation would be adversely affected and the livelihood of the local people would not be benefited. So there was a lot of sort of, if you like, well-intentioned, almost amateurish activity, but was often quite effective. Now you have much more sophistication. Obviously, you have anthropologists, you have people who are providing high levels of very sophisticated advice, and you probably also have a legislative framework which is much clearer these days than it was then. So, yeah, I mean, mining perhaps will always have an image problem, the mistakes when they happen do tend to get magnified or focused upon quite significantly. But the interesting thing is, I think that if you look at people like Sir Maurice Morby, he was one of the initial founders of the Australian Conservation Foundation.
Yes.
He was a botanist or amateur botanist.
Although he fell out of love with them, didn't he?
Well, he did.
Yeah.
He did after a period of time when criticisms which he thought were unjustified were being made against the mining sector. But some of the early efforts which were made in terms of vegetation, stopping sand drifts and Broken Hill, were done by mining engineers, in effect. And they had a concern with the environment. They lived in places like this. They wanted to make them better places to live. So it's a mixed bag in some respects. Certainly, as I said, some of the environmental practices, disposal of tailings into riverine systems, would not be accepted these days.
No, and it would be, I think, surprising to see an Australian Prime Minister stand up and open a mine these days, like Robert Menzies was very, very happy to do in the late 1950s. But that probably represents sort of the shifting perceptions within our local population about environmental issues, Indigenous rights issues and the like, rather than a discounting of the importance of mining to Australia, which has just been absolutely essential. Rob, thank you so much for bringing to us the history of Rio Tinto. What a story, and one that deserves a lot more attention and understanding, and you have contributed to that, so I really appreciate it.
Georgina, thank you very much indeed. Appreciate it.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn,